Hello again, and welcome to SCLC TV. I'm Maynard Eaton, your host, and of course our president and CEO, Dr. Charles Steele Jr. This week we have a guest, Vern Smith. We are talking about the black press. Dr. Steele, you're joined today by Vern Smith, a friend of yours, but also the recipient of this year's George Curry Award at our convention this week.
Thank you, Maynard. Yes, Vern goes way back in terms of his journalistic ability and being a part of the movement of telling it like it is.
Telling the story.
Telling the story. I'll just say this. I'm honored to have Mr. Vern Smith with us. And he also went to Torino, Italy with me, with George Curry. And we stayed a number of days. And Vern kept saying, we got to get the hook, which is the story. We got to get the story. And I thought I had the story. And then finally George came all smiling. He said, man, Vern excited. I said, what? It's a Martin Luther King school down the street. Let's go.
That was the story.
That was the story. And guess what? It was in Ebony magazine, the new birth of SCLC by Vern Smith.
Vern, you're receiving the George Curry Award, but you've been an award-winning journalist for years now as the Atlanta bureau chief of Newsweek magazine, the first African-American to have that sort of position. But we also thank you for being here.
My pleasure, Maynard.
Yesterday I told you about how the Chicago Defender has folded. Is a black press, that's a legendary newspaper, black newspaper, is the black press under attack, under fire?
Well, you know, the black press has been under siege for quite a while now, but you know, I would say the shuttering of the Chicago Defenders is really a sad time in the history of the Defender. If you took the Defender out of the historical timeline of black American progress, it wouldn't look the same. You know, you go back and you look at the Great Migration period when hundreds of thousands of black Southerners were moving to the north, you know, a lot of them to Chicago, you know. A lot of that, people thought that a lot of that impetus for moving came from people reading how well black people were doing in Chicago. You know, some of the plantation counties around Mississippi, they would ban the Defender, because they didn't want people to read about how well people were doing up north, and because they couldn't keep anybody on the farm to pick the cotton and harvest the crops. So the loss of the Defender, even though it is still going to exist in an electronic digital form, it's still a sad occasion for me, and I think for most of us who follow the history of the black press.
Speaking of black press, that played a key role in your political development and also the civil rights movement, has it not?
Absolutely. Without the black press, we wouldn't be where we are today. But I still say, Maynard, it also encompasses the civil rights movement, where we sitting in a position of amnesia, and some people call it blacknesia. We thought that once we got the 1965 Voter Rights Act, which we don't have no more because of Section 4, Section 5, I can't say that enough, it's been gutted, and it's 1964 Public Accommodation Bills, we thought that we could say we got it and it's going to stay here. Every time you accomplish and be successful at your goal, somebody is sitting in the rear, and most times up front, and smiling in your face and eradicating and removing everything that you have accomplished.
The black press, though, Vern, has been troubled by the lack of ads, I'm told. I mean, still good reporters there, although they're younger. Are we not reading, or they're just not making enough money to survive?
Both. But you know, the lifeblood of newspapers, particularly print newspapers, has always been advertising. You know, if people didn't advertise, you didn't have any resources to pay your staff. You know, and so that's been a continuing struggle. You know, it's been a kind of yin and yang kind of thing. You know, when we first came into the mainstream news media, you know, prior to that, and I would say for myself, you know, the late 1960s, early 70s, prior to that, the only place you could practice your craft was the black press.
Did you ever work in the black press?
I never did. As a staffer, of course, even when I was with Newsweek, I did a lot of freelance work for the black press. You know, George Curry, the late George Curry, who was the editor of Emerge magazine. So I did a lot of articles for him. I did a lot of freelancing for the Crisis magazine after I left Newsweek, because that was W.B. Du Bois's magazine, and I just liked the idea of having a byline in Du Bois's magazine.
NAACP?
Right, exactly. I told Julian Bond once, that I really liked, because Julian was the editorial director, the president of NAACP, that I really liked contributing to the crisis,
And to me, young journalists coming after you a little bit, that was the lifeblood of what our profession was about. We didn't have a chance. We didn't see much opportunity to be you necessarily at first.
Exactly.
But reading those black publications was the subcore, the substance of what black journalism was about.
It was where you could get printed at, and all of the great journalists that preceded me, Bob Maynard at the Washington Post, and Paul Delaney, who started at the Atlanta Daily World here, and then went on to the New York Times and other places. This is where they cut their journalistic teeth, And then, after the civil disorders, the rise of the late 1960s, when the mainstream media was really compelled on its own, not because they were looking to diversify to look good. They were desperate to find out what was happening in American communities that they had neglected on the one hand, and then on the other hand, in some communities, they had downright used the press, as kind of a cudgel against the civil rights movement, So the late 60s forward, after that Kerner Commission report, which studied the effects of the riots, and one of its recommendations was that the mainstream media needed to increase its representation of black reporters and brown reporters, because the riots kind of raised up out of nowhere, and that was a kind of, wow, we had no idea, kind of a thing. And so that may be the one time in American media history in which they actually were lively in recruiting talent.
I'm a product of it.
Yeah, exactly.
I was being the first black television reporter in Miami and different places. Yeah. They came looking for you.
It was it was in their self-interest to do it.
Maynard, let me add something.
Also want to talk to you about George Curry, your friend.
Absolutely. George and I grew up together, and he and Vern were friends, and he always talked so highly of Vern, and he said, Vern will go to Italy with us. And he was representing Ebony magazine, which was an honor to be in the presence of Vern and George at the same time. Let me just say this. This is a clear example of the lack of the business impetus within the black community. We see these things, we go to work, we have jobs, but nothing like business. And these magazines and papers and careers that we here in the African American black or disenfranchised community going to experience more and more of these type of situations, even here at SCLC.
Because they're not advertising with us.
Because they're not advertising with us, and also the story's not being told. The religious community is not talking about it. The political community is not talking about it. Everybody in this a period of time should be talking about the crisis of what Dr. King said, the 3 ills: racism, poverty, and militaristic.
Well, we're certainly fortunate today to have one of the greatest black journalists ever, who's a master storyteller. He's still telling the story. I'm Maynard Eaton. This is SCLC TV.